The notification of his father's death came on a Tuesday. James Thompson was just finishing his shift at the community center, where he taught music to underprivileged kids, when his phone buzzed with a number he hadn't seen in years. "James? This is Richard Caldwell." The voice said, formal and slightly strained. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news." James gripped the phone tighter, his heart suddenly pounding. Richard Caldwell had been his father's attorney for over 30 years, handling everything from business acquisitions to family matters. "It's your father, James. He passed away yesterday evening, peacefully in his sleep." The words hung in the air between them. James stared out the window at the fading sunlight, watching as it cast long shadows across the playground outside. "James, are you there?" "Yes," he managed, his voice hollow. "I'm here. There will be a reading of the will this Friday at the estate. Your presence is requested." James nearly laughed. His presence was requested? After 15 years of silence? After his father had made it abundantly clear that walking away from the family business, from the Thompson legacy, was unforgivable? "I'll be there," he said finally. As James hung up the phone, memories flooded back the sprawling Thompson estate. The tense family dinners, his father's disapproving stare when James announced he was pursuing music instead of business. And then there was Marcus, his half-brother, 7 years younger, and everything their father had wanted in an heir. His father, Augustus Thompson, had built Thompson Enterprises from nothing, transforming it into one of the largest private equity firms in the country. The Thompson name had weight, and Augustus had never let James forget it. Every opportunity, every privilege came with the expectation that James would eventually take over the company. But James had wanted more than spreadsheets and board meetings. He wanted to create, to connect with people through music. The day he told his father he was turning down Harvard Business School for Juilliard had been the beginning of the end. Now, 15 years later, he was being summoned back to the place he'd worked so hard to escape. James looked around the small music room, with its worn piano and walls covered in children's artwork. This was his life now, modest but fulfilling. What could his father possibly have left him in his will? And why did the thought of seeing Marcus again fill him with such dread? "I guess I'm going home," he whispered to the empty room, already feeling the weight of his family name settling back onto his shoulders. James Thompson had always been the odd one out in the Thompson family. Where his father Augustus valued calculation and strategy, James favored emotion and expression. His mother had died when he was 12, leaving him with a father who viewed vulnerability as weakness and a stepmother who viewed him as competition for his father's affection. When Vanessa gave birth to Marcus 7 years after marrying Augustus, the family dynamic shifted permanently. Augustus finally had the son. He truly wanted one who showed early aptitude for numbers and strategy, one who didn't question the path laid out before him. As James packed for the trip back to his childhood home, he found himself staring at an old family photo, one of the few he'd kept. In it, 14-year-old James stood awkwardly beside his father, stepmother, and 7-year-old Marcus. Even then, the divide was visible. Augustus had his hand on Marcus's shoulder, while James stood slightly apart, his father's other hand not quite touching him. James wondered what Marcus looked like now. The last time he'd seen his half-brother was at a chance encounter in New York City 5 years ago. Marcus had been with a group of business associates, dressed in an impeccable suit, looking every bit the heir apparent. They'd exchanged stilted greetings before Marcus was pulled away by colleagues. James had noticed how quickly Marcus had seemed relieved to escape the interaction. And then there was Richard Caldwell, his father's trusted attorney and advisor. Richard had been a fixture in the Thompson household for as long as James could remember. A slender man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually serious expression, Richard had always treated James with a forced politeness that barely masked his disapproval. To Richard, James's departure from the family business had been not just disappointing but offensive, a rejection of everything the Thompsons had built. Richard had been Augustus's right hand, executing his wishes without question, managing the family's legal affairs with meticulous precision. James remembered how Richard would sometimes watch him during family gatherings, as if assessing a potential threat. Had Richard changed in the past 15 years? Had any of them? As James zipped his suitcase closed, his phone rang. It was Marcus. "James." his half-brother said, his voice deeper than James remembered. "I just wanted to make sure you were coming." "I'll be there," James replied, noting the tension in Marcus's voice. "Good. Father would have wanted, well, he would have wanted you to be present." James doubted that very much. "How are you holding up?" There was a pause on the line. "I'm managing. There's a lot to handle. The company, the state, it's overwhelming." For a moment, James heard something in his brother's voice, uncertainty, perhaps even fear, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Richard's been helpful, of course," Marcus continued, his voice returning to its businesslike tone. "He's handling everything just as Father would have wanted. Just as Father would have wanted." The phrase echoed in James's mind, a familiar refrain from his childhood. Everything in the Thompson household had to be just as Augustus wanted. "I'll see you Friday," James said. As he hung up, James wondered what his father's final wishes actually were. In 15 years, Augustus had never reached out, never attempted reconciliation. What could he possibly have to say to James now? Whatever it was, James had a feeling Richard Caldwell would be controlling the narrative, just as he always had. The Thompson estate had always been imposing a sprawling Georgian mansion set on 20 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds. As James's taxi crunched up the gravel driveway, he felt like he was 16 again, returning from school to face his father's inevitable disappointment. The house looked exactly the same. White columns flanking the entrance, manicured hedges lining the walkway, the Thompson family crest carved into the stone above the door. Only the flag flying at half-mast indicated that anything had changed. James paid the driver and stood for a moment, suitcase in hand, staring up at his childhood home. He'd sworn never to return, yet here he was. "You made it." Marcus stood at the top of the steps, hands in the pockets of his tailored suit. At 35, he looked remarkably like their father, the same strong jaw, the same confident posture. But there was something different in his eyes, something James couldn't quite place. "I said I would," James replied, climbing the steps. The brothers didn't embrace. Instead, Marcus extended his hand, which James shook briefly. "Richard's waiting in Father's study," Marcus said, leading the way inside. The house smelled the same leather-bound books, polished wood, and that particular blend of expensive cologne their father had always worn. James followed Marcus to the grand foyer, past the portrait gallery where generations of Thompsons looked down disapprovingly, and into Augustus's study. Richard Caldwell rose from behind the massive oak desk that had been their father's. Age had bent his tall frame slightly, and his hair had gone completely white, but those piercing gray eyes were unchanged. "James," Richard said, extending his hand. "It's been a long time." "Yes," James agreed, noting how Richard had positioned himself in their father's chair, as if he were now the master of the house. "Please, both of you sit." Richard gestured to the leather chairs facing the desk. "Where's Vanessa?" James asked, suddenly aware of his stepmother's absence. Marcus's face tightened. "Mother is resting. She's been affected by Father's passing." Richard cleared his throat. "Shall we proceed with the reading?" From a leather portfolio, Richard withdrew a thick document bearing the Thompson seal. "The last will and testament of Augustus Elijah Thompson," he announced, his voice taking on a formal, almost ceremonial quality. James sat back, letting the familiar legal phrasing wash over him. The preamble was standard revocation of previous wills, sound mind and body, the usual declarations. Then came the bequests to various charities, substantial donations, to longtime household staff, generous pensions, to Vanessa, the vacation properties, and a considerable trust. When Richard came to Marcus's name, his voice seemed to gain energy. "To my son, Marcus Augustus Thompson, I leave my controlling interest in Thompson Enterprises, the family estate, and 60% of my remaining financial assets." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. Richard adjusted his glasses and continued. "To my son, James Elijah Thompson." James found himself holding his breath. "I leave my collection of musical instruments, my personal library, and a trust in the amount of $1 million, to be administered by Richard Caldwell." James blinked. That was it? The instruments and books were worth something, certainly, but a small fraction of the estate, and a trust administered by Richard meant he wouldn't even have direct control over the funds. There's a personal letter as well, Richard added, sliding an envelope across the desk. James took it, noting his name written in his father's distinctive handwriting. The rest of the estate goes to Marcus, with a provision that he continue to run Thompson Enterprises according to the principles I have established, Richard concluded, closing the document. I don't understand, James said, the letter heavy in his hand. The trust. Your father wanted to ensure the money would be used responsibly, Richard interrupted, his tone suggesting that James was incapable of such responsibility. Given your lifestyle choices, James felt heat rising in his face. My lifestyle choices? James, Marcus interjected. Father was concerned about how you might use a larger inheritance. The trust ensures you'll be comfortable without, he trailed off. Without squandering it, Richard finished. The terms are quite clear. You'll receive a monthly stipend, with larger distributions possible for approved expenses. James looked between Richard and Marcus, searching for any sign of the deception he suspected, but their faces remained impassive. May I see the will? James asked. Of course, Richard replied, sliding the document across the desk. You'll find everything is in order. James scanned the pages, but the legal language was dense, filled with clauses and subclauses that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. I'd like my own lawyer to review this, James said finally. Richard's expression hardened slightly. That's your right, of course. But I assure you, everything is exactly as your father intended. As James left the study, the unopened letter from his father still in his hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His father had been many things demanding, critical, even cold at times, but he had always been fair. This will, with its controlled trust in Richard's oversight, didn't feel like his father's work. It felt like Richard's, back in his childhood bedroom, now converted to a generic guest room with no trace of his existence. James finally opened his father's letter. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. James, asterisk by the time you read this, I will be gone. I know we have not spoken in many years, and for that, I bear much of the responsibility. I was too rigid, too unwilling to see that your path could be different from mine and still valuable. Asterisk, I have watched your career from afar. The community center, the children you've helped, you've created something meaningful, something entirely your own. I respect that more than you know. Asterisk, there are things I should have told you in person. Truths that should not have waited for this letter. Business has been difficult these past few years. Decisions were made, some by me, some by others that have put Thompson Enterprises in a precarious position. Asterisk, trust your instincts, James. You always saw what others missed. Asterisk, your father, Augustus. James read the letter 3 times, trying to make sense of it. This didn't sound like the father. He remembered this reflective, almost apologetic voice. And what did he mean about the business being in a precarious position? According to financial press, Thompson Enterprises was thriving. Most puzzling was the final line. Trust your instincts. Was his father warning him about something? Or someone? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. When he opened the door, a familiar face greeted him, Mrs. Chun, the housekeeper who had been with the family since before James was born. James, she said warmly, embracing him. It's so good to see you. You too, Mrs. Chun. She glanced down the hallway before speaking again, her voice low. Your father asked me to give you something if anything happened to him. He made me promise. From her pocket, she withdrew a small key. To his private safe, she explained. In the library, behind the portrait of your grandfather. James stared at the key in confusion. Why wouldn't he mention this in the will? Mrs. Chen's expression turned grave. He didn't trust Mr. Caldwell toward the end. They argued. I heard them several times in the months before she trailed off. What did they argue about? I don't know exactly. But after one particularly bad fight, your father changed the combination to his office safe. He never did that before. James closed his hand around the key. Thank you, Mrs. Chun. Be careful, she warned. Mr. Caldwell is here often. Even now, after Mrs. Chin left, James waited until well after midnight before making his way to the library. The house was silent, with only the occasional creak of settling would disturbing the quiet. The portrait of his grandfather, Augustus Thompson Sr., founder of the original Thompson Investment Group, hung in its usual place above the fireplace. James carefully removed it, revealing a small wall safe. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a single USB drive and a handwritten note. For James the truth. James quickly replaced the portrait and returned to his room, heart pounding. He plugged the drive into his laptop and found a single folder labeled Thompson Enterprises Private Audit. The files were extensive financial records, email exchanges, meeting minutes spanning the last 5 years. James wasn't a businessman, but even he could see that something was very wrong. The company's public financial statements showed consistent growth and profitability, but these internal documents told a different story. Assets had been overvalued. Losses had been hidden through complex accounting maneuvers. And behind much of it, according to emails between his father and various financial officers, was Richard Caldwell. In one particularly damning email, dated just 3 months before his death, Augustus had written to Richard, asterisk this ends now, I've arranged for an independent audit. The board will know everything by the end of the quarter. I won't let you destroy what my father built. Asterisk. Richard's response was chilling in its simplicity. Asterisk reconsider, Augustus. Think about what this would do to Marcus's future, to the Thompson name. Asterisk. James sat back, stunned. Richard hadn't just lied about the will. He'd been manipulating the company's finances for years, and his father had discovered it. But what about Marcus? The email suggested he might be involved, or at least that Richard was using him as leverage against their father. James needed more information, and there was only one person who might have it. The next morning, James drove to the offices of Thompson Enterprises. The gleaming skyscraper in downtown Boston had always symbolized his father's success and James's rejection of it. Now, as he rode the elevator to the executive floor, he wondered if the impressive facade was just that, a facade. I'm here to see Diane Parker, he told the receptionist. Diane had been his father's executive assistant for over 20 years. If anyone knew what had been happening in Augustus's final months, it would be her. James! Diane appeared in the doorway to her office, surprise evident on her face. I didn't know you were coming. I should have called, James admitted as she ushered him inside. I need to talk to you about my father. Diane closed the door and lowered her voice. I've been expecting you. Your father said you might come someday. He did. She nodded, opening a drawer and removing a thick envelope. He left this for you. Said if anything happened to him, and if you ever came asking questions, I should give it to you. James took the envelope. Diane, what was going on between my father and Richard Caldwell? Diane's expression darkened. Richard has been steering the company for years. Your father trusted him completely until about a year ago. What changed? Augustus discovered discrepancies in the financial reports. When he confronted Richard, things got complicated. Diane hesitated. Richard has something on Marcus. I don't know what exactly, but it was enough to make your father back off temporarily. Blackmail? James asked, incredulous. That's what it sounded like. But Augustus was gathering evidence. That's what's in the envelope, copies of everything he found. James opened the envelope and skimmed the contents, more financial records, but also what appeared to be transcripts of conversations between Richard and various business associates. In one, Richard explicitly discussed hiding losses from the board. Does Marcus know about any of this? Diane shook her head. I don't think so. Not the extent of it. Anyway, Marcus worships Richard, thinks of him as a mentor. And the will, the one Richard read yesterday, is it legitimate? Diane's eyes widened. What did it say? James explained the terms Marcus receiving the bulk of the estate, James getting a controlled trust. That's not right, Diane said firmly. Your father revised his will 6 months ago. He split the company's shares equally between you and Marcus. James felt a cold anger settling in his chest. I need proof, Diane. Something concrete I can take to a lawyer. In the envelope, she said, There's a copy of the Real will signed and notarized. Augustus gave it to me for safekeeping. As James left Thompson Enterprises, the envelope secure in his bag, he called a lawyer friend in New York. Then he called Marcus. "We need to talk," he said when his brother answered. "Not at the house. Somewhere Richard won't find us." There was a long pause. "The boathouse," Marcus finally said. "1 hour." James arrived at the old boathouse on the edge of the Thompson property, memories flooding back of summer afternoons spent rowing on the lake with his mother. Before everything changed, Marcus was already there, looking out over the water. "Why all the secrecy?" he asked as James approached. Instead of answering, James handed him the folder of documents. "Read these." He watched as his brother's expression changed from confusion to disbelief to anger. When Marcus finished, he looked up, his face pale. "How much did you know?" James asked quietly. "None of it," Marcus whispered. "I swear, I didn't know what Richard was doing. But he has something on you, doesn't he? Something he's been using to control you, and through you, control Dad." Marcus looked away. "A mistake I made years ago. A bad investment that would have ruined my reputation if it became public. Richard helped cover it up, but he's held it over me ever since. And the will... Richard said Father wanted it this way, that he was protecting you from yourself." Marcus met James's gaze directly. "I should have questioned it. I'm sorry." James felt a strange mixture of anger and relief. His brother had been complicit, but also a victim. "We need to confront Richard," James said. Together, they agreed to meet Richard at the house that evening. James arrived first, finding Richard in Augustus's study once again. Papers spread across the desk. "James," Richard said, barely looking up, "I understand you're leaving tomorrow. Good. Time to get back to your life." "I'm staying," James replied, taking a seat across from Richard. "In fact, I think I'll be here for quite a while." Something in his tone made Richard glance up sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means I know what you did, Richard, to the company, to my father, to his will." Richard's expression didn't change, but James noticed his hand tighten around his pen. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The falsified financial reports, the threat to expose Marcus if Dad went public, and the fake will you presented yesterday." Richard removed his glasses slowly. "Those are serious accusations, James, especially coming from someone who abandoned his family responsibilities 15 years ago." "I have proof," James said, placing Diane's envelope on the desk. "And so did my father." "Is that why you killed him?" Marcus's voice came from the doorway. Richard's head snapped up. "What?" Marcus entered the room, carrying another folder. "The medical examiner's preliminary report," he explained, tossing it onto the desk. "I had questions after talking to James, so I asked for a rush analysis. Traces of digitalis in his system, enough to trigger a heart attack that would look natural." Richard's composure faltered for the first time. "This is absurd. Your father had a heart condition." "A mild one," Marcus countered. "Not enough to kill him without help." "You were losing control," James added. "Dad was going to expose you to the board. You couldn't let that happen." Richard stood suddenly. "You have no idea what I've done for this family. When your father was making reckless decisions, I stepped in. When the market crashed in '08, I kept this company afloat through methods your father was too principled to consider." "Illegal methods," James said. "Necessary ones," Richard snapped. "And then he gets cold feet, wants to come clean. Do you know what that would have done? Prison for me, certainly. Disgrace for the company. The Thompson name dragged through the mud." "So you killed him," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly, "and tried to turn us against each other with a fake will." Richard laughed bitterly. "You two were already against each other. I just used what was already there." "You were wrong," James said. "About us. About Dad." Richard's eyes darted toward the door, calculating. "Don't," Marcus warned. "The police are already on their way." Richard sank back into the chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. He was going to ruin everything. "No," James corrected him. "He was going to save it. The right way." When the police arrived minutes later, Richard went quietly, his shoulders hunched in defeat. As the officers led him away, James turned to Marcus. "What happens now?" "We rebuild," Marcus said simply. "Together, like Dad wanted." 6 months later, James stood at the podium in the Thompson Enterprises conference room, addressing the board directors and key employees. "Today marks a new chapter for Thompson Enterprises," he began, still unaccustomed to public speaking in this setting. "The legal proceedings against Richard Caldwell have concluded with a guilty plea. The financial restatements have been filed with the SEC. And most importantly, we've begun implementing the vision my father had for this company's future." From his seat at the head of the table, Marcus nodded encouragingly. "Some of you knew my father better than I did, especially in recent years," James continued. "But in these past months, as my brother and I have worked to understand what happened, I've come to know Augustus Thompson in a new way. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, both in business and in family. But he tried to correct those mistakes. He valued integrity, even when it came at a cost." James gestured to the large portrait of Augustus that hung on the wall. "In his honor, we've established the Augustus Thompson Foundation for Arts Education, which will provide musical training to underserved communities across the country." A small ripple of applause moved through the room. "As you know, Marcus will continue as CEO, while I'll serve as chairman of the foundation and special advisor to the board. Together, we're committed to ensuring that Thompson Enterprises stands for more than profit, it stands for principle." As the meeting adjourned, Marcus approached James. "That was good," he said. "Dad would have been proud." "Of both of us," James added. Outside the conference room, Diane was waiting with a small package. "This came for you," she said, handing it to James. Inside was a set of keys and a note from Mrs. Chun. "Asterisk, your father asked me to give you these as well. They're to the lake house. He said someday you might want a quiet place to compose music again. Asterisk." James felt a lump in his throat. The lake house had been his favorite place as a child, the one spot where his father had occasionally relaxed, even played the piano himself. "She gave me something, too," Marcus said, showing James an old photo of their father holding Marcus as a baby, with young James beside them, all three smiling. "I don't think I've ever seen this before. There's a lot we didn't see," James replied. "About Dad, about each other." That evening, as James walked to the Thompson estate, now legally half his, though he had no intention of living there, he stopped in his father's study. The room had been preserved as Augustus left it, his presence still palpable in the worn leather chair, the books lining the walls, the faint smell of his cologne. On the desk sat the music box James had made for his father in high school woodshop, a clumsy, imperfect thing that James had been certain his father had thrown away. But here it was, kept in a place where Augustus had spent his most private moments. James wound the key and listened as the simple melody filled the room. "Morning Has Broken," his mother's favorite song. 1 year to the day after Augustus Thompson's death, James and Marcus stood side by side at the dedication of the new Thompson Center for the Arts. What had once been an abandoned warehouse was now a state-of-the-art facility with practice rooms, performance spaces, and classrooms. He would have pretended to hate this, James said with a small smile. Too impractical, too sentimental. But secretly, he would have loved it, Marcus finished. In the audience sat Mrs. Chun, Diane, and many of the children from James's old community center, now employees and students of the much larger Thompson program. As they unveiled the plaque bearing their father's name, James reflected on the journey of the past year, the pain of discovering Richard's betrayal, the shock of learning that their father had been murdered for trying to do the right thing, but also the unexpected gift of reconnecting with Marcus, of discovering the man their father had been trying to become in his final years. The brothers had chosen not to make public the full extent of Richard's crimes, protecting the company and their father's legacy while still ensuring justice was served. Richard would spend the rest of his life in prison, convicted of financial fraud and second-degree murder. More importantly, James and Marcus had discovered a way to honor both sides of their father's legacy, the business acumen that built an empire, and the appreciation for art that he had suppressed but never lost. "I never thought I'd be back here," James admitted as they walked through the new center after the ceremony, "let alone working with you." Life is full of surprises, Marcus replied. Some terrible, some wonderful. In a quiet moment, James found himself at the piano in the main performance hall. He hadn't composed anything new in years, too busy with teaching to create. But living in the lake house these past months, surrounded by memories of both his parents, inspiration had finally returned. As his fingers moved over the keys, playing the piece he'd written for this occasion, James thought about the lessons of the past year. How deception could destroy, but truth could heal. How even the deepest family wounds might mend with time and understanding. How his father, for all his flaws, had tried in his own way to make things right. The melody rose and fell, carry with it all the complexity of family, forgiveness, and finding one's way home. When he finished playing, the small audience that had gathered applauded warmly. Marcus approached, extending his hand. "Ready to move forward?" he asked. James took his brother's hand. Together,